Welcome to this edition of Faith and Family First, the Triple F podcast. I'm Jim Hochberg, going to be talking with Eva Andrade today. And what we're going to try to figure out is, what is a constitutional right and how do you know what it means? What's a right? Let's think about that in the context of Second Amendment things happening here in Hawaii right now. All righty, let's talk about it. Eva, so you tell me, how do you know you have a constitutional right?
Well, for me, because I'm a person of faith, I go back to what rights were given to me by the great God, because that's where my rights come from. I don't know where everybody else thinks their rights come from, because the Constitution does give you some rights. But where do my true rights come from? From the great Almighty God.
Well, you got an F.
Well, no.
Failed answer.
Every pastor is going, she got an A+.
No, I said, how do you know you have a constitutional right?
Because the Constitution says all of our rights come from where? It says.
That was the Declaration of Independence, but you're getting us far afield. So let's go back to the question. How do you know you have a constitutional right? Because you've experienced it. Remember, good Catholics, they're experiential. We experience constitutional rights because we know if we get arrested, they have to read us our rights. You have the right to remain silent, blah, 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 blah. That's in the Fourth Amendment. If you are being asked questions by the government, you don't have to answer because you have a constitutional right, the Fifth Amendment. You don't have to incriminate yourself.
I have the right to remain silent.
That's right. You also have the First Amendment right to go to church, to practice your religion. You have the First Amendment right to free speech. All of that stuff is actually describing the citizens' rights vis-a-vis the government.
Right.
And people forget that. Constitutional rights are about what the government is not allowed to do to you. And if we think all the way back to the 1780s when the Constitution was being debated, there were the Federalists that wanted a strong constitution, giving a strong federal government, and there were the Anti-Federalists that did not want a strong federal government. So they did not want the Constitution to provide a lot of power.
And people that are interested in this should actually read all the papers from
Yeah,
the
they're
time.
the Federalist papers.
Yeah,
you can look at them online.
Yeah, they're great.
So how did the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists decide to come together in agreement to suggest that the new citizens of the United States agree to and adopt the Constitution? What they did is they said, okay, Anti-Federalists, we get it. You're very afraid of a strong federal government. We're going to have the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, as the very first thing we do after we pass the Constitution. So it was all agreed to, written out. It wasn't like we passed the Constitution and slowly over time the 10 amendments got passed. It was boom, boom, boom. So, but the thing is, at the very beginning, and because of what's written in the Constitution and in the amendments, including the amendment that allowed women to vote and the amendment that took away and then gave back the right to have alcoholic adult beverages, those things were expressly stated. And then in 1973, we found out that there were penumbras of rays of light from the sun behind the clouds of the Constitution that created the right to abortion. So then we said, okay, so there are some rights that actually aren't expressly stated, and that's one of them, right? The right to abortion. And since then, a lot of sex-related stuff, transgenderism, sexual orientation, all, that's coming through as well when it's not stated in the language. But I wanted us to say, okay, how strong are unstated constitutional rights opposed to the stated constitutional rights? And we, again, look at abortion. And we say, wow, in order to change abortion restrictions during the 50 years that Roe and progeny were the governing constitutional law, it could not be what? What was the test?
I'm not answering.
An
You've already
undue-
dinged me twice. I'm going to stay silent.
Undue burden, right? You can't put an
I have
undue burden
I
on
have
an
the right to
abortion
remain
right.
silent.
You do.
I do.
Okay, so that's what I wanted to get to, the undue burden test. After Roe, every single Supreme Court decision dealing with abortion restrictions that states tried to pass always had to ask the question, is this restriction an undue burden? If it was an undue burden, the Supreme Court struck it down, and the state legislation restricting abortion failed on constitutional grounds. Okay? Let's jump forward to 2022. In June, the United States Supreme Court made its decision in the Bruin Second Amendment case. Now, the Second Amendment is expressly written in the Constitution. It's not the penumbra of the rays of sun behind the clouds of the Constitution.
And this is the right to bear
grows.
arms.
This says, yes, Congress, that you have the right to keep and bear arms. And what did that mean? So there was really no question what that meant for 150, 200 years of our nation's history, because everybody knew what it meant. You can carry arms around. And then cities and states started restricting ownership of guns and use of guns by requirements to qualify, by limiting where it had to be. Before the Bruin case in 2022, in Hawaii, if I wanted to go shoot any of my firearms, in order to comply with the law, and people probably don't even know this, in order to comply with the law, I had to put my firearm in a case and put that case in the trunk of my car. And that case with my firearm couldn't have any ammunition in it. That had to be in a separate case, also in the trunk of my car, until I got to the firing range when I could take them out, or the hunting location, when I could take them out, put them together so they were useful, because I'm not really too keen on hitting somebody with a gun. They do that in the movies all the time. That ain't me. Okay, that was the law.
Now, on that note, so I pulled the testimony of the Department of the Attorney General, and this was a very recent testimony. So this was March 1st, and this is on Senate Bill 1230, which is the bill that is moving right now to bring Hawaii to match now what happened in Bruin. But this ties in with what you just said. So according to their testimony, and I quote, for 170 years since 1852, Hawaii has protected public health and safety by carefully limiting who may carry guns in public. For decades, a system of discretionary licensing was used. The police departments would evaluate an applicant and decide whether there was good reason why that person needed to carry a concealed firearm in public.
So the Bruin court already addressed them. And because they work in the Department of the Attorney General in the state of Hawaii, they should know way better than to use that argument, because it is 100% fallacious. And I will tell you why.
Okay.
I will tell you why.
Okay.
Because what Bruin said is, in order to have any restriction not violate the undue burden on the exercise of the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms, it has to comport with the tradition and history of the United States in the founding era, which was 1776 to 1790, when the Second Amendment was adopted. If the restriction was in place then, it'll probably be okay now. Or in the Civil War era, because the 14th and 15th Amendments were passed after the Civil War, which made the first 10 amendments applicable to the state governments. Prior to the Civil War, the state wasn't restricted from infringing on your Bill of Rights. What the Attorney General is either bald-faced lying and knows is wrong, or is so ill-informed they should resign.
Well,
hang on. What they are wrong about is, in the 1850s and in the 1790s, Hawaii had nothing to do with the Constitution of the United States. And therefore, who cares what was going on in Hawaii during that period? That does not meet the standard of the tradition and history in the founding era and the Civil War era in America under the U.S. Constitution. And that frustrates me beyond belief, because either they're idiots and they don't recognize that at the Department of the Attorney General, or they very well do know and they're just lying to the legislature.
Well, just like with the bills that move through the legislature, you always have your introductory part, and it seems to me like that's part of their introductory part of their testimony.
Their testimony.
And they do go on to talk about Bruin, and what they're saying is that the Supreme Court's Bruin decision represents a very significant and disruptive change for our state. In the wake of Bruin, many more people are applying for licenses to carry a firearm. Okay, that's true. I know that for a fact, that a lot more people are. Under Bruin, those licenses shall be granted unless there is an objective statutory basis requiring denial.
And that is wrong. The objective statutory basis has to be part of the tradition and history in the founding era or the Civil War era under the United States Constitution. They didn't accidentally mention 1857 Hawaii law. They didn't accidentally mention that. They're trying to squeeze in between. Well, and it's not going to work.
What I'm trying to do is, because, you know, you've done a lot of work. We want to be clear so that it's full transparency, that you've been testifying at the Capitol on this bill, right? And you've been opposing any bills.
I filed a lawsuit for Second Amendment carry permits in 2019 and won it in 2022.
Right. So you know, to be clear,
in Hawaii,
you know, what you're trying to do in your experience and knowledge, because you do use a firearm. I mean, you're a person who actually believes in it, uses it. So you're not just someone that's fighting for these imaginary rights. I mean, you're something that is very, very near and dear to your heart. And there are probably a lot of people listening that probably agree with you. But as I've been talking to people, maybe because of in Hawaii's tradition, we haven't been a big gun state. There are so many people that don't want to see more guns on the streets here in Hawaii. And so I want the conversation to at least be open enough, you know, to address people's concerns so that we're not glossing over it.
People need to be informed.
Right.
And what they need to realize is their fear of people carrying guns is directly related to the news or the personal experience they have with people that they know or themselves being shot or injured by a firearm. Firearms are scary. They kill people. That's true. None of my firearms have ever hurt a soul. You know why? Because I never pointed them at anybody. The people who are going to qualify for permits to carry have the safety training to know that you'd never point the muzzle of a firearm at anything that you don't intend to shoot. It's only the target that you point at.
And that is a comment that we have heard over and over again in the media in the whole Alec Baldwin case.
And why they even had a real gun on a movie set is stupid.
Well, that's true. But I mean, but what you just said is what they were saying, that you wouldn't point it at somebody anyway. I mean,
unless you thought it wasn't a real gun.
Well, but even.
But I want to go straight to the heart of the fear that a concealed carry permit explosion in Hawaii of carry people is something to be afraid of. Nothing to be afraid of. And I'm going to use, as an example, data. Texas, 2020. Texas had 1,626,242 active concealed carry license holders. Okay?
That's a lot. What is the population in Texas?
I'm going to get to that.
Okay, good.
So therefore, 5.7% of Texas's population, 5.7%. So the Texas Department of Public Safety reports that 5.7% of the population committed 0.4% of the state's serious crimes, being responsible for just 114 out of a total of 26,304 convictions. And that's because the criminals that currently carry firearms without a permit in Hawaii and have been forever because they're criminals, they're the ones that are hurting people with guns. The concealed carry people are not every single one of them, because sometimes people do bad things when they usually wouldn't for whatever reason. But the assumption is quite fair to make that people that go through the process of getting a concealed carry permit are going to be very safe firearms holders in Hawaii, just like they are in Texas, and that's not who you need to be afraid of. You need to be afraid of the people that aren't supposed to have them because they didn't get the permit, but they're still out carrying them around and hurting people because they are criminals by definition. The other interesting thing is, every year the FBI reports statistics on the number of illegal shooters that get stopped by a legal carry person. So instead of being afraid of it irrationally, we should welcome it as a safety function.
Well, okay, I've heard this same argument, though, when it comes to like marijuana. You know, oh, we have to legalize it so we can regulate it, and there's not going to be more use. I mean, all of those are the same things I've heard.
Those aren't data driven. That's just subjective ideas.
Well, I think that, and I can't argue the facts. You've read them as they are, and so I come from a family. My mother is from Missouri, and my dad is a local boy born and raised here. So they have very different opinion on guns. My mom's family, they were shooting out and hunting from when they were very young. And so they're very familiar with guns. They're very familiar with gun safety. My mom has a very large family. There was never any accidents in her family of people shooting each other accidentally or whatever, because they take owning a gun very seriously.
Correct. And
right?
Everybody should.
They do. Now, my dad grew up here where it was not about guns and all that. So my dad doesn't want to see the way we do business here in Hawaii change at all. And maybe it's not so much that person that you're talking about that does everything the right way, that goes in there and does all the things right, and they're treating the gun. But what happens is that if they're not 1,000% on top of where that gun is and what it's doing, can it get in the hands of a family member that would not have had access to it before, like maybe the crazy son-in-law that has anger management problem.
Part of the safety includes exactly the storage as well.
Well, and
that's why I am not worried at all about concealed carry permitted people being the source of a lot of danger. It's not. But here, let me share just a little bit out of this SB 1230 Senate Draft 2. The legislature wants to add into the structure this. And what I want people to do as I'm reading this is ask themselves, what is the standard? Because the government has to have some kind of a standard that can be judged against whether or not it's an undue burden on the exercise of the Second Amendment right to carry a firearm, right? So the issuing authority is the chief of police in each county, because they issue the permit. The issuing authority shall not issue a permit to acquire the ownership of a firearm to any person where the issuance would not be in the interest of the public health, safety, or welfare because the person is found to be lacking the essential character or temperament necessary to be entrusted with a firearm.
So are they going to do a personality test?
In determining whether the person lacks the essential character or temperament necessary to be entrusted with a firearm, the issuing authority shall consider whether the person is likely, the matrix, whether the person is likely to engage in conduct other than lawful self-defense that would pose a danger to self or others, as evidenced by whether the applicant has any history of threats or acts of violence by the applicant directed toward their self or others, or a history of use, attempted use, or threatened use of physical force by the applicant against another person, or it goes on and on and on. It doesn't say conviction. The old law said if you were convicted of a felony, you didn't qualify to even get a permit to acquire.
So now they kind of want to assume.
So now they're saying if you've been accused of something by your ex-girlfriend, your kid that doesn't like what you're disciplining them about, accusations. And again, legislature knows better. The Department of the Attorney General knows that this cannot pass the constitutional test to protect constitutional rights that we learned from the abortion stories.
Well, it'll be interesting to see what happens as the bill moves, because there seems to be, at least in our internal poll, and when I say internal poll to people, what do you mean? It means we kind of look at the voting record, right? We kind of see what these guys are doing. And it looks like the legislature is behind getting this bill passed.
Of course they are. Our legislature loves to think they're smarter than us and helping us. But there's a whole other section of this law.
And I wonder if this
deals with the legislature recognizing the Supreme Court ruled in the Bruin case, June of 2022, we have to let qualifying people get carry permits in Hawaii. We must, because it's a constitutional right. And we can't unduly burden the exercise of that constitutional right. So they're going to come up with a huge, all-encompassing list of sensitive places where even if you qualify for a permit, you're not allowed to carry in those places.
And these would be like schools,
And
hospitals.
the Supreme Court in the Bruin case said those places are also to be evaluated based on the tradition and history during the Civil War and the founding eras under the United States Constitution. So in other words, if there were sensitive places that people could not have guns, even if they could have them other places, and there were 4 within the tradition and history in the founding era and the Civil War era under the Constitution of the United States, schools, courts, legislative assemblies, and there was one other one that I'm not remembering. That is not what this bill comes up with. This bill says if you ride public transportation, you can't have a carry permit. Or you can have the permit, you can't exercise your right. So if you don't have a car or a bicycle or a moped or a motorcycle and you ride the bus or the train that we're someday going to have, then if that's how you get around, you can't carry. If you want to go to a public building of any kind, if you want to go to a restaurant, if you want to go to a private place, unless the owner of the private place says you can carry, you can't carry. If you want to, seriously, if you want to go to a park, if you want to go to a shopping mall. So what they're doing unconstitutionally, it's a complete undue burden on the exercise of the right. They're basically doing what New York and New Jersey have done since Bruin, which have consistently lost in court challenges. I testified to the legislature that that's what's happening in those other jurisdictions. They don't care here. I think the way our legislature calculates what they're doing is they don't really care if it violates the constitutional right to carry. They want to get as much mileage for as long as they can before the U.S. Supreme Court slaps them again. That's basic. And they're happy to have violated your rights for as long as they can until the Supreme Court slaps them.
Well, I think it's interesting because I was looking at the testimony on this, and another thing that the bill does, and I want to get your thoughts on this, is it requires a person carrying a firearm in public pursuant to a license to maintain insurance coverage.
Which there isn't any here.
Well, it's interesting because the AG's office actually brings that up. And in their testimony, they go, we kind of like what you're trying to do here. We kind of see that this might be a good way to go. But they say the department also recognizes that there are a number of areas of uncertainty that presently exist in this area. To that end, the committee could consider deleting the proposed section 134C, which is page 11, line 12 through page 12, line 12 from the bill, and instead requesting the Legislative Reference Bureau to conduct a study analyzing the use and effectiveness of systems of insurance and other financial responsibility requirements.
But if insurance is so important around carrying guns, and it's only been 8 or 9 months since Bruin, why wasn't the legislature requiring all the criminals that are carrying guns to at least have insurance?
Well, it's interesting to see where
for 100 years.
Well, it's going to be interesting to see where this goes, because I remember on the issue of COVID, no, it was before COVID, the government, Obamacare, right? The question was, can the government force everybody to get insurance coverage? Remember, that was a big discussion.
Correct.
So, how that came down finally was that they could create Obamacare, right? I mean, that was allowed, but were they allowed to force people to have it? That was the question.
Well, and the interesting thing in the testimony in the Senate committee on SB 1230 initially, they asked the AG, what is this insurance available? Because Senator McKelvey, I think, has a lot of knowledge about the insurance industry. He may have worked in it or something before. I was very impressed with his question. And the AG said, well, yes, this is the AG. I forget his first name, David, I think, David Day. And he was kind of like, well, that's a good question because, well, we don't really think there is any right now, but that's why we're suggesting that you make the provision not effective until 2050 to give some time for the industry to grow up around the requirement.
Oh my God, that sounds like the old, we've got to pass this bill to know what's in it.
Exactly,
right?
Exactly. And the thing people need to realize about insurance, you can buy insurance to cover things that are accidents. It's very difficult to buy insurance to cover things that are done intentionally. And if a bullet leaves the muzzle of a firearm and hits somebody, unless it ricochets before it hits them, the person that pulled the trigger is responsible because they intentionally pulled the trigger. So even if you're required to have insurance, it probably won't cover the bad guys that intentionally, illegally, and wrongly shoot somebody.
Well, here, and I use this statement all the time, even when we're fighting marijuana. Just because you legalize something, it doesn't mean that you're going to get rid of all the bad fringes that come with all these things. I mean, so.
But here's what I want people to think about in the last 2 minutes.
Okay.
For 50 years in Hawaii, you and I, for a large part of that, have been struggling with the legislature's grip on protecting abortion rights, which turned out was only a ray from behind a cloud of a penumbra of a constitutional right. Why are we letting them kick and strangle the Second Amendment rights that the Supreme Court of the United States in June of 2022 made it unquestionably clear everybody in the state of Hawaii has the right to carry under the Second Amendment?
Well, I'm curious to see what you guys think, our viewers, our listeners. Please use the comments below and tell us whether you like that Hawaii has going down this road because of the decision in Bruin, or do you think that you are happy with what our legislature is trying to do by making all of these strict requirements that Jim says him and his buddies are probably going to sue if it passes. In fact,
well, if you want to support ongoing constitutional litigation, the Second Amendment Center is a charity on the mainland that's supporting doing our case here. Go Google them and send money. There's a button in there to send to Hawaii.
Well, and you wrote a letter to the governor on that. Why don't you end on that?
Well, I've written a letter that we're hopefully going to be able to meet with the governor and share that it's just this SB 1230 is never going to pass muster at the Supreme Court.
All right. Well, make sure you like this video, share, subscribe, hit that notification button so you'll always know when we upload a new video. Hey, if you want to partner with us to make this happen, send me an email at eva@hawaiifamilyforum.org. But in the meantime, have a great week, and we will see you next week. Mahalo, everybody.
Bang, bang. Aloha.